Heritage Matters number 12, which is on heritage and values. I'll come to that in a minute. I would like to express my thanks to Anant National University and the International Center for Inclusive Cultural Leadership for enabling this series of webinars, which started at the beginning of the pandemic. And this will be our last webinar for the year, and then we start again with the next iteration next year. We're also a member of the UNESCO Network for Tourism, Culture, and Development. And I would like to acknowledge the network as well, which is chaired by Sorbonne Juan Patillon, Paris. And is everybody? Okay, right. So some of you might wonder why 7:30 in the evening, because it works really well for the Americas, for Europe, for Africa, for most of Asia. I'm an Australian, so my Australian friends tell me that they can always listen to the recording, so be it. And today's webinar is on heritage and values. And we recently conducted research and evaluation of Heritage Matters webinars, which reveals that the COVID-19 has opened up opportunities. Remember, opportunities. We did polling and opportunities to address inequities in the system, to embed sustainable in sustainable development goals, transform education and workplaces to rebuild the way we do things, rethink leadership as transformative, inclusive and collaborative, scope with immediacy, new approaches to climate crisis, and address culture as an integral part of UN Agenda 2030. To sustain these aspirations, especially from the younger generations, how well can we focus revealing the values of the built environment, reshaping urban conservation, and consequently enabling cities to develop towards more inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable environments? Could we address the indivisibility of heritage and values to build future possibilities and normalities? Yes, in plural, multivocal, pluri-praxis. Remember, it's pluri-praxis to respect global cultural and linguistic diversity. Eminent panelists are joining us this evening to stimulate thinking through questions and contestations. We're very privileged to have Professor Dr. Anna Pereira Roders, UNESCO Chair in Heritage and Values from TU Delft, one of the top institutions in the world in Delft, the Netherlands. I was very privileged around the same time last year to be at Professor Roders' inaugural lecture as the UNESCO Chair when she gave a brilliant lecture on heritage and values. And then we have Professor Rabindra Vasavada, architect, former head Center for Conservation Studies at CEP University, Ahmedabad, which is one of the most reputed institutions in India. And then we have a young person, like we always do, every webinar, we have a young person, the next generation, Ritika Khanna. She's a heritage consultant and a researcher with a master's in World Heritage from Berlin, and she works from New Delhi. And I'll be your host for this evening. I'm Professor of Inclusive Cultural Leadership at Anant National University, and one of the founding members of the UNESCO Network for Tourism, Culture, and Development in Paris. Now, all of you, I mean, our research shows that people, our research shows that people usually Google the panelists. So we're not going to do any more introductions. You already had the minimal introduction. And then they make a decision whether they want to join in for the webinar. We have 301 registrations. Usually we average 500, but it's that time of the year with Christmas, but also many things happening on Saturday evenings now that the lockdown is being eased. And with nearly 100 people, we'll come up to 100 people actually in real time, but more than that, joining us. We've closed the chat box, and you might wonder why, because people are always, saying things which are not necessarily focused. So we decided to close the chat box. And the one question that always comes up is, are we going to give certificates? The answer is no. because no certificate without assessment, we don't do any assessment. Thanks to Anant National University, this webinar is free, and all our webinars are free. And so heritage and values, and why we chose this is because of Professor Roders. It's a UNESCO chair. It's not heritage values, heritage and values. And she produced this seminal volume and reshaping urban conservation. And that's what she's working on is transformative discourse in heritage conservation, urbanism, but she's very much grounded in praxis. And that's where she's not just talking about the theory, but actually walking the talk. And now I'll hand over to Professor Roders. Anna, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. You can hear me correctly,
yeah, we can
right?
hear you.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Amar, and thank you, Mount National University. I'm very privileged to be joining you and giving this small presentation talk. It's a pleasure, and it was also Amar was a special guest in my public lecture, so I'm very happy to be here with you. And indeed, heritage and values is a topic which is very, very, very dear to me because it is as if I never stopped being a 4-year-old. You know, when we were 4-year-olds, we were always asking why, and heritage and values is all about the why we value what we value, what we want to keep for future generations. And for me, that was also very interesting and at the same time puzzling why some aspects of our culture would be more appreciated than others. And that's also what it led me to somehow start to relate sustainability with heritage, because I would see it as when you're lacking the value, then you consider those resources as waste. When you attach extreme value to it, it's on the contrary, then you even list it as heritage. So I'm very fascinated with this dichotomy and to see how different cultures and even ourselves getting older, that we start appreciating our environment, our context, our culture differently. So, and that affects, of course, heritage as well and heritage discourses, because you have seen over the last years and the last decades how many more categories, you could call it, of heritage has been being added and considered exactly to include more and more different cultures and their interests on what should be heritage. And that also came in line with more values being acceptable and broadened into the value system of what could be the reason to list something as heritage, to keep it for future generations. So now you have tangible, intangible, movable, immovable, natural, cultural, digital, analog, everything. You could say everything could be heritage if we want to, as long as we add value to it. And that is why I find this so fascinating. And I thought, well, I graduated as an architect. I have so many questions. I go do a PhD and then I'm done. I answered all my questions, but that's not true. all new questions and even more fascination. So I think I will continue researching about this topic and how it affects how we change our cities in my professional life. But what you can notice is that due to the way society has been developed and created, that in a way, heritage is still an exception to the rule. So you can serve heritage, but the rest is more permissive on what you can do. And this does not go much in line with what Amar mentioned about the Sustainable Development Goals and everything we want to achieve for a better future for our society and for our planet. So I really think we need a paradigm shift there, where maybe sometimes conservation is is going beyond heritage only, and also not always more can be considered as heritage. So I would like just to tell you some different things we found out. I'm not sure how much I'm in time. Maybe I'm half time now, 4 minutes, maybe, maybe less. But I would like to tell you that there is much discussion about what are those values. So, and we have developed over the years a system of assessment to understand exactly the different domains of heritage and values. And we identified not only the traditional, historic, aesthetical, scientific, social, age values, but also political values, economic values, and ecological values. And these values by themselves, they are quite different in dynamics, and they are quite different on also their tolerance they have towards what can change and what cannot change in the city. An historic value is much more conservative, you could say, than an ecological value, which is based on an ecosystem process of evolution. So all these different values are very interesting to give and inform how the city can change. Then values can also be positive and negative. So it is sometimes assumed, oh, economic values are negative, historic values are positive, but that's not the case. There are situations where the coin is flipped and you see exactly the economic values as being of added value to conservation, and the historic values due to a focus on a certain narrative or on a certain style or identity, national identity, that then the historic values are very intolerant and negative towards communities and society. So we are always trying to break up these different values, how they affect change, if they are negative, if they are positive, if they relate to the intrinsic qualities of the heritage or how we perceive it, because that's also different. Just like a glass of water, we may like it or not, but water is very helpful, healthy for us, for our living. And I think that that is also a difference in values that you can understand better. And then as part of society, you also have your own personal values. You have values that you share with your families, with your school, with your education, with your teachers, with your community, and with society as a whole. So all these dynamics, you know, now I didn't leave the university after my PhD because it's such a fascinating question. And we like, as Amar said, every time to work together with local governments, with safeguarders of heritage and such, so that we can keep coming back and bringing the lessons from practice into theory and reformulating theory and bringing it back to practice, so that practices could also compare themselves with others and see if their goals can be better achieved for the future. So I think I will stop. I took maybe more than my time, but I would just like to tell you, you can Google me as you like to find my CV or publications or to contact me. And I look forward to our discussion with the other distinguished guests. Thank you, Amar.
I keep forgetting this. Um, uh, Thank you very much. I mean, it's every time I hear you speak, you always say things in a very simple way, but you're inspirational in that, in the way you put things across. I mean, you talked about intrinsic and extrinsic, which are constantly changing, but also the whole question of, the public discourse where heritage sometimes becomes forgotten with other issues taking over. Later on, I'll come back to you, but the question that I have for you to think about is, we had public intellectuals like Edward Said, Noam Chomsky. In India, we have Romila Thapar. There are many public intellectuals who actually focus on a whole range of issues to ensure human rights, social justice, but also cultural justice, to address inequities and keep the consciousness of the community or public going. So later on, if you could address that. Now we'll move over to Ritika Khanna. Ritika, what does your generation think about everything we are saying?
Sure. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Perfect. Okay, I'll start then. So, thank you, Professor Galla and Anant National University for having me here today. And I also extend my greetings to everyone joining this webinar from different corners of the world. When I was invited to speak on today's theme, which is heritage and values, I was immediately reminded of a famous article by the sociological and cultural theorist Stuart Hall. The article is titled Whose Heritage? With a question mark. And I believe this is the question we should ask ourselves when we begin to assess values of heritage. Now, this leads us to our second question, which is what are values? Now, most English dictionaries define the term value as both a noun and a verb. So, as a noun, value means the relative worth or importance that we ascribe to something. And as a verb, value is that abstract action of respecting something with regards to its worth, excellence, or importance. Now, this simple explanation leaves us with no doubt that anything that is termed as heritage is of value and must be valued. But how do we determine values of heritage is the question. Now, in terms of built heritage, the 1972 World Heritage Convention of UNESCO is an excellent guiding document that provides a framework for understanding how values of heritage can be historical, aesthetic, scientific, and anthropological in nature. The operational guidelines of the convention lay down a set of 10 criteria as per which values of a property can be assessed, and each property being nominated on the World Heritage List has to meet at least one of these criteria. Excuse me. As many of us would already know, the concept of World Heritage looks at significance of a heritage property in terms of its outstanding universal value. This means that to be inscribed on the World Heritage List, the cultural or natural value of a heritage property should be so exceptional that it transcends national boundaries, are of outstanding interest to present and future generations, and therefore must be protected as common heritage of a whole of mankind as a whole. Now, while this concept of values or outstanding universal value as enshrined in the World Heritage concept is a noble concept, it is often brought under scrutiny for not fully encompassing the communities that lie at the heart of any heritage. It is for this reason, as I also pointed out in the beginning, that we must ask ourselves, whose heritage is it? Who has created this heritage? Who values it? Who will preserve it? And it is not surprising that the answer to all these questions tends to be the same. It is the communities. Now, as we see today that the modern world encompasses large communities which are globally connected and internationally dispersed. This makes the concept of heritage as an ongoing and evolving process. And as Stuart Hall also points out, this discursive practice involves the self, the community, and the state. Therefore, it must be underlined that the values that we ascribe to heritage are often created as a result of interaction and negotiation between communities and the built environment. As the field of culture continues to expand, it is all the more important that modern studies of cultural heritage must increasingly include first-hand experiences of communities, their identities, and its representation as a critical component of heritage understanding. By studying the values of heritage from the perspectives of the communities, we can explore the challenges and opportunities of building more inclusive representations of heritage. One of the steps towards this goal could be through a critical examination of how communities are represented at heritage sites. Properties inscribed under UNESCO World Heritage List provide especially fertile ground to examine and perhaps even restructure the current notion of values and heritage. Such an examination may lead to some important questions, such as, out of the over 1,000 sites inscribed on the World Heritage List, how many sites directly address the values associated with communities? Is inscription on the World Heritage List the ultimate accolade that validates the value of a site? How do we integrate communities and build awareness about the value of their heritage? How do we educate the future generation? These are some critical questions we need to ask ourselves as the discourse on heritage and values expands. Recently, the Government of India has launched the National Education Policy 2020 that gives priority to promotion of art and culture in school curriculum. This is a welcome step to instill heritage sensitivity in the younger generation and ultimately develop acknowledgement of heritage and values. I would also like to point out that the COVID-19 pandemic may not be a favorable time to live in, but it has definitely provided us a window to reflect on what really matters. As we slowly move towards recovery, nations are implementing safety measures to reopen their cultural heritage sites and other cultural institutions. Allowing citizens to reconnect with heritage and its values may well be a part of the catharsis that we're all looking for right now. And with that, I'll end my intervention, and I would be happy to receive any questions related to what I spoke about. And any further information on me and my work could be found on LinkedIn, and maybe a lot of you have already Googled me, as Professor Galla mentioned. So thank you.
I've unmuted myself now. All right, thank you, Ritika. That's wonderful. And I think this whole notion of community groups, it's an ongoing discussion. And the question that you raised about who owns whose heritage and who manages, who interprets whose heritage. I mean, these are all critical questions, and the whole relationship, power and authority become very critical in this discourse. But thank you for raising all these key issues. Now, someone who has been dealing with some of these challenges of who owns whose heritage and has worked on a range of research dealing with both World Heritage and heritage conservation in general. And at least to the best of my knowledge, 2 nomination dossiers, one from Ranini Cave, and these are the stepwells very close to Ahmedabad, and the other one is Ahmedabad World Heritage City, is Professor Vasavada. Professor Vasavada, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Galla. And thank you, Ananta University, for inviting me to this webinar. It is something, which is a crucial issue as far as conservation is concerned. And I'm going to reflect on some of the thoughts and ideas, which actually came up while we were working on the historic city of Ahmedabad. Because this was a kind of exercise which was happening perhaps for the first time. And, while working on it, I think we had no parallels or no indigenous examples, to look for. And so it was something, where we were actually trying to struggle to come up to the level which was actually expected by UNESCO in terms of World Heritage. And, identifying the outstanding universal value was something, which was a kind of challenge, which was also something which we had to really, discover in our own ways, you know. Luckily, you know, looking at the heritage of the city and the history of the city, I think it was very, very evident that this was one small city which had a kind of history, you know, which was almost 600 years old. And it also had a kind of community, you know, structure and community sort of, you know, settlements, you know, which were actually very unique in a way and which were well preserved for a very long time. It was a kind of multicultural city, and you know everything was sort of harmonized, and there was a tremendous sense of you know multicultural identity also. You know, so it was something you know where we constantly sort of debated within our team and with you know people who were the local historian as well as the people within the city, which were actually a very enlightened kind of nobility, you know, which was involved in building up the city over, you know, ages. Now, talking about, you know, the today's subject, you know, which is heritage and value, and also talking about the importance of the chair, which is established in Delft, where Anna is heading. You know, one of the key sort of concern the chair expressed, I mean, the subject expresses is to make cities and human settlements more inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, which was actually the goal set up by the declaration in 2011 for the historic urban landscape. And, you know, fortunately, I was able to sort of also meet Francisco Bandarin, you know, who, along with the other author, had done a wonderful book on this. And they sort of suggested in one of our meetings in Delhi how we could go about and look at the city from this point of view. So I had a lot of help because, you know, frankly speaking, you know, locally or within the country, there were very, very few experts, you know, who had the experience of working on World Heritage City. So I had, you know, a kind of a team of experts, you know, who advised me. And fortunately, with the help of York and the Center for Conservation at York, and you know, we were able to somehow get Jukka Jokileto, you know, as one of the experts, you know, here in Ahmedabad, with Henry Clear, you know, who was also earlier a part of the ICOMOS, and he was sort of also sort of considered as one advisor here. But basically working with Yukka, you know, it was extremely helpful because they stayed here for almost for 10 days and we had extensive tours within the historic city. And basically, you know, to sort of get their advice on how to really isolate and identify the values and then how to discuss that, you know, with the local, you know, sort of people and stakeholders. Because one of our most important connection, you know, of our entire team was with the local people because we were actually surveying the entire city and almost 65,000 properties, you know, we had surveyed, including the settlement areas, you know, which were very important. Out of it, some 56 we identified as the important domains. So getting in touch with the local people, measuring their houses, spending time with them, because each pair of you know workers from our team, they were architects, they were students. They sort of spent considerable time with this family, and we took almost 6 years to build up the material of documentation. So this, you know, staying with this family for 8, 10 days constantly, talking to them, meeting to them, knowing about, their attitude to their ancestral places, was a great sort of help for us to realize that there was a tremendous, you know, element of pride, within these people, which actually helped us to also understand how 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 dearly they valued whatever they had. So this, as Ritika was mentioning, this this family value, which is translated together with the community value, which actually comes up to somehow build a settlement in a particular way and to respect it, out of the community bondage, was something, which we could virtually realize ourselves while working within the city. So the most important part is to somehow understand that how to make, this kind of resources as inclusive. And this is something, which we sort of identified at that time as one of the most important values. And you know, the other thing was that while working, how one really understands through discussions with them, because ultimately, if you talk of values or heritage, I think it is a kind of societal construct, and this kind of construct is really developed by the society itself. And it is also this, that this kind of construct is constantly changing, because I think cities are evolving, people are progressing, and along with this, the idea of value is also many times, you see, evolving, changing, and it is something, which is ever changing. So we have to also really study this, because I think there were families which were staying there for generations. There were sort of families which are younger, although having connections with their earlier generations and the houses in which they lived. But, how they somehow, you know, kept themselves rooted to something which was traditional, and how they were actually trying to change things, to suit their own, lifestyles, which were undoubtedly progressive. So this is also something, which we actually understood there. Now, when we talk of these kind of, values, I think when we were working on the historic city, it was not only that. You see, it was not only the values which were expressed by this, but then there was also which we called as a cultural kind of attribute, which is culturally very relevant. But then there was a sense of historic value also, to the historic city. I mean, there was a tremendous tradition of a kind of rule. There were 5 phases under which the city was ruled, 5 different kind of agencies, and how this history also made a tremendous emphasis and sort of impact, on the values, which were there, in terms of the historic city, which we really studied. And I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit beyond the time, but I would like to say that we had to also, worry about the values, which were historic, and we also had to really understand how things were used, which means we had to really understand the use value. Now, in case of the historic city of Ahmedabad, I think we found that the the core city, even the earlier plotting, which was say, developed during the Sultanate and later period, was still intact almost in the entire city area. There were only very few aberrations, but the plotting, which we really considered as something, which was a tremendous, value which was coming from use, and I think the plotting, which was done during the Sultanate and later period is still, preserved. So that is a very significant part. The the culture, you see, which was expressed more than the house itself, was at the street level, and if you see the timber architecture of the city is something, which was really preserved extremely well in most of the cases. Now, of course, there are aberrations coming up very fast because of the age of the material and the decay, that has really affected. And that is where the
So
the
tell
whole
me,
effort of
Feroz,
conservation will begin.
Professor
Sorry?
Vasavada, you raised a number of issues, and
Yes.
and a number of issues, and it's wonderful you mentioned Juka and Henry Clear, 94, the NADA recommendation. I was part of the 28 people, with the two of them. And one of the challenges we found in 94 is with the very notion of intangible heritage. It was very early days. And uh, do you think that people working in the heritage field are still very site-centered, object-centered, or uh, located in the built environment and see intangible heritage as an add-on? That's one question I have. I'm also getting questions, on my messenger here. And the second thing is this whole notion of, values. I mean, Anna used a plural, and she was talking about, they also change. Ritika, this is a question for you. There's the intergenerational value. It changes. There's a whole ethical issue over there. And Anna, in her book, emphasizes the whole question of ethics. I think there's a whole range of questions that you've raised. But given your tremendous amount of experience that you have, Professor Vasavada, yes, the new educational policy is an opportunity, like Ritika has said, for us to rethink the way we craft our curricula, develop our pedagogy to make it more inclusive. Do you think we really have the capacity to do it, or do you think it needs a lot of effort? Do you think educational institutions, I know that people like Anna are very young, so there's a big opportunity to change. But what do you think? Do you find in your journey, people flexible to accept challenges, to changing the curricular pedagogy?
Yes. At least as far as I was concerned, I have never faced any difficulty.
Because you're a
And
towering authority, so they had
sorry,
you. I said
sorry.
you're a towering authority, so you just led the way. So, but we need more of that
No,
leadership.
no, because I tell you, no, even in terms of my course, when I founded that in 2007, it was the SEP's idea to also talk about the settlement at the
Right.
same time, the architecture, you see. So it was something, which SEP itself also thought about, you see, because I think this is something which I took on. And then I thought it was extremely meaningful. And to tell you the truth, once I worked out the entire course, it was actually vetted by Sir Bernard and the York, university. So before they vetted this, I never went forward.
Right.
So I had a full freedom, and I think uh, accepting where the institutions of architecture, which are too much cowed down by the university, in some cases, otherwise, I think we have all the freedom that we want to really try out.
That's fantastic. That's so positive. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm raising these questions to create some kind of a discussion because I'm getting questions on my
Yep.
phone over here. So thank you very much. Anna, you
Thank you.
leading.
I'm sorry to exceed. I'm
No,
sorry
no,
to
not
exceed
at
your
all,
time.
Professor. Thank you for your time and your deep perspectives. Anna, you lead a very young faculty. I mean, amazing, you know, postgraduate students, researchers, undergraduate students you have, and also interdisciplinary comes very easily. Like one of the things that I was most impressed when I was there, you don't talk about, you have a department of urbanism, not the city as a finished artifact, but urbanism as a process. Uh, could you reflect on the importance of interdisciplinarity and how the Hull recommendation has become a catalyst for this?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I'm a bit less optimistic than than Professor Vasavada, even though I'm an uncurable optimist. So I always think that we are going to change, like Gandhi did. So I think if you really look cold into the policies in local governments, there's a lot to change still, and the older education programs, they still, many of our colleagues, unfortunately, they still rephrase and use a narrative as heritage being something that it stops creativity. And even though there are some changes towards the direction and you see heritage as an opportunity, you embrace more than those values which were traditional considered. I wouldn't say that the conversion into having an architect which is interdisciplinary, that listens to communities, that embraces their wishes fully in their design process and decisions, we are not there yet. Yeah. And also not on the famous top architects you see. I would say that it is still very much a traditional process of design. There is co-creation, there is growth, but it's, as I said in the beginning, the exception to the rule rather than the rule in itself. But I would like to tease a little bit the discussion. I would like to say that not all values change. And especially if you could, there are different generations living in that city, and by psychological terms of emotion, you feel connected to it. So unless people have a negative experience, they will always feel very bounded to their homes, to the places they go to school, to the squares they use or the markets. So even though the communities change, the fact that they use those spaces embraces and strengthens the social values. And also if, and then in reply to Rikita, also not all the values which are at the description of the outstanding universal value, they are just exclusive from the universal level, abstract, international, but many of what is written in those narratives, they convey values to certain attributes in the city, which communities value too, but they value for different reasons. So if they value the market, they value because maybe they met their husband or wife, or because they feel very social bond to it. And maybe an historian values it for its design of the historic moment in time where an event happened, also still very intangible. So I also question this notion that only intangible started a few decades ago. Intangible was already there, but conservation was focused on the tangible rather than the conservation accepted also the intangibility of those contexts. So I would say that sometimes there is an assumption that values are changing. People are changing, we die, we are not eternal. Contexts are, especially older contexts like Cairo and other cities. So other people come, but they bound to their context, to their living. So there is much more continuity that you would actually think when reading literature. And by doing more and more research, we can really see findings that confirming this, that there is many more trends that we would think with this assumptions always in literature saying that values change, everything changes. But as we are humans, we love our places, our homes, our cities, and that makes us a little bit more probable than we would think. So I would say to answer that and to tease a little bit that actually their values are much more constant than we think. Society not, because we die, unfortunately. And then there are also commonalities between what it was written in the outstanding universal value and what people value, and that what bounds them together is the attributes, the specific elements, tangible and intangible, that makes those locations special. And then going back to your question, and then I stop.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, it's absolutely continuity and change in values, and something anthropologists have been talking about for a long time. But also with intangible heritage in '94 with Nara, it was actually a challenge to say that, to tell everybody, look, this is nothing new.
Yeah.
And in fact, the national program that I ran from Canberra in Australia, affirmative action program, way back in the 80s, we were already teaching what is now called intangible heritage, but it was called Aboriginal Society and Adaptation, so how it was changing. And now there's a question that's come uh, to Ritika. Ritika, you there? Yeah, there you are. Please respond to the following statement and inclusiveness is a pillar of heritage, and as value is grounded in place and time, it seems to address value is best achieved at the level of jurisdiction, namely city, a province or region or a country. If the statement sounds agreeable or not, where in the world this jurisdictional approach is applied and how?
So,
Are you there?
taking
You're frozen.
a part of the question is this, but when we enter that jurisdiction, there are little parts of it, values, which could also stand alone and have their own values. So to say that values are always recognized in a unit of a city is not entirely correct, because unit of a city, but when you enter the city, there could be a little tank somewhere where you went with your grandmother, and that could have personal value to you, and you don't really know how to express it in terms of the national or the international recognition. So I think, yes, value does apply to the jurisdictional level, if that's a term. But within it, there are certain aspects which could be very personal and could also be standalone features.
Well put, Ritika. By the way, we usually have people from over 60 countries, and we have 129 countries from where participants come from our webinars. When Ritika used the word tank, what we use it in India is for a reservoir or a catchment area for rainwater. Usually when a village is founded traditionally, according to the text, you dig a tank or reservoir, then you establish the village. Just like when you build a house, you dig a well and you build a house, right? And that's what she was meaning. So just because we have very high participation from Africa in our webinars too. Uh, Now the next question is to Professor Vasavada. Please surface again, you disappeared. Um, Professor Vasavada, are you there? Yes. Um, the question is to you specifically addressed. Will indigenous poetry, folk tales, folk songs, traditional forestry preservation be part of intangible heritage? And the question is with regard to India and dealing with heritage conservation.
Yes, yes, it will be.
Yeah, you could be, but only yesterday it was announced that there's a heritage railway that's been decommissioned that services, sort of tribal people for whom a lot of these things are important, but that heritage railway is also part of their storytelling, their knowledge.
Yep.
Would you like to reflect on that, please?
Well, in fact, this is something, which was a lifeline for the people of Dangs, which are essentially the folk.
Could you speak up, please, because we can't hear you. Speak up, please, yeah.
No, so this is something, which was a lifeline for the people of Dangs forests, which are essentially still a very dominant folk community. And it certainly affects them because the rail was going to the areas, where there are no roads, So this is something, which was, which I don't think, they preserve the Darjeeling and Shimla, these narrow gauge railways, as World Heritage. But this is something, which is serving one of the most, vibrant folk culture. I think it is not really looked upon that way, So this is something, which requires serious thinking.
So this brings us back to the cultural and linguistic diversity in our societies, hierarchies, discrimination, and how certain cultures and certain values are put on a hierarchy and others are marginalized. I'm not saying it's in India, it's all over the world this
Yeah.
happens. It's a constant battle. I mean, Black Lives Matter has brought up a lot of these issues to the surface. So, Anna, you mentioned about migration and values. Would you like to take over there and elaborate a little bit more?
Yes. Yes, indeed. And I would also like to go back to your original question when I finish my presentation, because it's also connected to this question, where I always I don't some literature then concludes that then the heritage is not inclusive, but I would see more as the fact that heritage is not inclusive to as a symptom of that society. So it would be a surprise if a society is inclusive and the heritage isn't, and vice versa, so that a society is not inclusive in its policies, in its programs, and then the heritage is. So I see heritage and how the conservation of heritage is undertaken actually as an indicator on how a society is inclusive with its minorities, with its diversity of its culture, of its history, if there are episodes that they want to hide, if they just put forward just one narrative instead of multiple narratives. And it's very much, like you said, with Black Matters, is very much a mirror of its society. And I think that sometimes when we heritage experts just focus on heritage, they forget about this bigger context and that it's just society reflecting the same level of inclusiveness and respect for each other. Going into migration, indeed, I think that is very interesting. And in some of the PhD students we have been working with communities, you really realize how different this community concept is. And especially when there are different cultures. So, and sometimes it's also the assumption that the community is something clear, defined, monocultural, and original, where in many cities where there has been constant exchange of cultures and even the arrangement of a globality of cultures, like port cities and other capital cities. There are different cities where all this diversity is so rich that the moment that those families move around, then all their heritage goes with them. So that's also why it is so fantastic now with social media, that you see groups of diaspora being created, and people caring about their heritage, even though they are kilometers away, and it's still heritage to them. So who are we to say it isn't, and just focus on those that live locally on the corner, you know? So I really think it's important to think broader and really try to understand. That's also, we do projects studying and analyzing social media as anthropologists used to do with communities, to really understand how broad this value is in the world map.
Thank you, Anna. I mean, you put it beautifully. Heritage often is seen as a construct, but not as an idea. If you think of it as an idea, it's evolving, it's dynamic, it's spirited in many ways. But I think it's really wonderful the way you put it. Ritika, there's a question to you. Oh, by the way, back to Anna. In when Australia was still, like 1989 is when Australia developed a multicultural policy, and I was privileged to host a national conference on issues in multicultural heritage management. The opening address by one of the Aboriginal elders, the late Charlie Perkins, he just stood up and looked at all the people, all these key bureaucrats, directors, heritage managers, community representatives. He said, Aboriginal Australia is over 60,000 years old. we've always been diverse. We've always been culturally, linguistically diverse. What's this thing about multiculturalism now? We've always been multicultural. It's just that that which is multicultural now we realize because of colonialism, we created inequities, and we want policies to address those inequities and those inequalities. And I think that in some ways, it's almost like you were there in 1990 with our elder, Charlie Perkins. You know, you probably, were you born then?
I was born already, yes.
The
No, but
next
I would
one,
also, yeah, Amar, if I can make
sure.
a small comment, because even during colonialism, families were created and cultures were mixed.
Yep.
And it's very hard, especially on those cultures and families that were born from the interchain of cultures, to be now split into categories. Who are you? Are you 25% blood of colonialism? Are you 25% blood of local? Are you 25% blood? So I really have problems on how colonialism is being discussed, and as if we are all different.
Yeah, and the same thing I found, you know, after I listened to your lecture, I went to Vienna where they had a symposium on decolonization. And they're all neat categories. And I just couldn't understand how you could have such neat categories, you know. And they forget that culture is dynamic and living, and you can't have. I think this is where some very basic epistemological issues have to be addressed. And you mentioned research, and I know your setup, you know, at Delphi, you focus on research quite a bit, and you have a lot of young people, very diverse. I found them to come from very diverse cultural backgrounds. And there's a kind of shared space that you facilitate. Thank you so much. Now, the next question is to Ritika. Is culture affected by the administrative or natural boundary of a region? And Ritika, is community also heritage? That's the question straight from someone. So over to you, Ritika. You have to unmute yourself. Unmute.
Yes. Am I audible now?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. So to answer the question, is a community also heritage? Yes, everything related to a community is heritage. And if we go into the details of how heritage is defined and how heritage is practiced under the various international standard setting instruments also, particularly the Intangible Heritage Convention of 2003, we will realize that what binds a practice together is the community. So whatever you nominate to be recognized as of value and as heritage has a community backing to it. So if it is a traditional practice, it is practiced by a certain community. If it is a craft, it is often a community of artisans who practices it, and then they become a community of common craftsmen, and that's how the craft also gains a community related value to it. So yes, communities are definitely heritage, and they, in fact, they form the backbone of the heritage practice. Professor Galla, could I request you to please repeat the other question of administrative boundaries?
Is culture affected by the administrative or natural boundary of a region? Of course.
I'm not sure how to, from what perspective to answer this question, but I would think of it in terms of the buffer zone that we often create when we nominate a World Heritage property. So it could be that something that is away from the buffer zone and does not have an administrative control of a certain body. It may not have that much of still may have the significance, but may not have that much of popularity as something that comes under the administrative control of a certain body that is recognizing that particular place as heritage. So that's where I think culture can be affected, but I think practicing of culture should not be affected by any boundaries, particularly administrative.
Thank you, Ritika. Well said.
Thank you.
Oh my God, there's series of questions to you, Anna, all of them coming through, because they're specifically saying Anna, so I better.
Very good. So they feel they are friends already. I like it.
Anna, I have the tendency to see heritage not only as historic buildings, but I also look at the big picture, the city. I perceive the loss of values when the environment in a city changes without considering those values that are bonding. And uh, bonding, connecting people to the place. What can you tell us about it? During your research, what have you found during your research?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we are developing it. So we started very much deducing out of the listed heritage, and reveal the broadness of values which was there already, which was considered much more limited than actually was. But over the years, we have been exploring new methods to actually, through social media, to deduce based on what people post, the pictures they post, the comments they make, their appreciation for the places they live in. And you could say it's a sort of bottom-up process of recognizing what is heritage to them without necessarily being listed as heritage. So I do very much agree on this big picture element, focus or motto. And I think it's important to consider this dimension of understanding what is listed and accepting that not everything which is heritage is listed, and the other way around. What I would also say is that we are humans, so we keep adding value. And I will give you an example. For example, the music, a Casa de Música, music house, you could say in English, from Rem Koolhaas in Porto. It was very controversial because it's very architectural in style. It was intrusive on the way it was created. And there was many commotion around the neighborhood and the communities involved, because it was as if an alien, a spaceship had landed in the neighborhood. And if you would analyze social media, if you would go to the public discussions, everyone was against it. But over time, because this Casa de Música was a place to host music, social events, culture, activities, and the neighborhood was also redesigned so that there would be a space for children to play around. Then over the years, also that negativity changed, and people became more and more positive and giving value to that place. They still see it as a spaceship, but now they attach value to it because it's part of the neighborhood and facilitates social encounters and culture development, which was not there before. So to this sense, to not always see that when things change, that it always is for the negative. It might be temporarily for the negative, but then society sees it again, a positive aspect out of it.
You reminded me of my very first month in Australia, way back in 1977. The Australian Capital Territory, which is one of the most planned capitals in the world, they built a television tower on Black Mountain, which is a prominent part of the landscape. So people were really upset. You're spoiling our landscape. You're spoiling the beauty of the city. We don't want this ugly thing. They kept on saying, all the planners are men. This is about their ego, because it's a tower. And then when it was decommissioned, years later, because with satellite technology, and there was discussion about removing it. Oh my God, people lined up saying that, no, it's part of our landscape. It's part of my growing up here. As you drive into Canberra, you see, all kinds of arguments were made why we should keep it. So you're absolutely right. This is how we attribute, values as we go along. Anna, the next question is also to you. Picking up on Anna's reference to the UNESCO Hull recommendation. By the way, those of you are hearing, Anna was very much part of the team, with the drafting of the recommendations.
With Ron, of course.
Ron and you, yeah. I was there as a witness. So I was in the General Assembly, so I was there as a witness. So recommendation uses layering. The Bara Charter insists on managing change, but the 2011 ICOMOS Valletta Principles uses continuity. To be allied to this day's agenda focused on the UN SDGs, should we not focus on continuity across the board? That's a question to you.
Yes.
It's a good point.
Yeah, fantastic. No, the layering, it's key for, I think the layering is a sort of keyword of the HUL, because it's a layering of values, a layering of societies, a layering of time. And in fact, I think what is so fascinating of the HUL is that it gives us an open card to innovate and to change heritage planning towards something that fits the needs of the specific context. Not anymore saying a specific category of heritage, not anymore setting a doctrine as a few charters used to do in the past. So I think that this is something that definitely I would definitely see more discussion about this continuity and what it actually means in the years to come.
Yeah. Well, the next question again to Anna. Since you're involved in Hull, could you reflect on your understanding and experiences of how the value was approached or treated in Hull application so far? An example of a success or a challenge?
Do they mean in nominations towards World Heritage, or?
Just a recommendation.
Oh, yeah. Well, I would suggest to follow Ballarat's nomination in the long term, because they first started as being a lab of the HUL, and years after, then they decided to put forward a nomination. And there you really see the process which the colleagues have been undertaking together with communities to draft it. I'm just following it by the distance, but I would think that that probably Ballarat is the first nomination which is not only mentioning historic urban landscape, but fully rooted on trying to implement this more inclusive process.
Thanks, Anna. By the way, those of you listening participants, Ballarat is a gold mining town in Victoria, where Melbourne is the capital in Australia, if you want to know its location.
Yeah, and it's a nomination regional, so it's not just focused on the city. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that I'd like to hear from Ritika too about this question of, how application, and then the whole question of continuity and change. Ritika, what do you think? If we want to be allied to the UN SDGs, should we not focus on continuity across the board rather than trying to manage change?
I think these two words, continuity and change, are inextricable when we talk of heritage, because as we evolve and as time proceeds, we can't but give in to the fact that continuity is happening and change will happen. So we may like it, we may not like it, but at every point we will find ourselves at a juncture where we have to manage continuity and change. Maybe the younger generation, as we put it, which is my generation, who are the young professionals right now, maybe we are not at that juncture where we have to manage so much of change. But as we grow into our field, a lot of change would have happened, and it would be the next generation who would have had to manage it. So I think continuity and change do go hand in hand, and we have to manage it all the time.
Well said, Ritika. We're into binaries all the time. We like binaries. It's non-binary, sort of.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And Professor Vasavada, is a colonized heritage considered real heritage, or does it have to be decolonized to be perceived as real heritage? It's a very, with all your experience, you can answer that.
No, I think what is what is what is sort of coming down the phases and what is happening at a particular given time has to be there. It is heritage. You can't decolonize it. How do you decolonize it? If it is colonial, well, it is a phase of history, and I think that very well stays, as part of your history. I don't know what is meant by decolonizing.
Maybe it's the mind, decolonizing the mind and the discourse, but you can't decolonize the heritage, can you?
Exactly. How can you decolonize built environment?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't understand this question. I think this has to be really further sort of clarified.
Yeah. Well, let's leave it there because I think it's a huge challenge.
So.
And but the next one for you, Professor Vasavada, is for World Heritage nomination for cities tends to lead to the same process of heritage-led urban regeneration, which focuses on tourism and gentrification of local communities. Would you like to reflect on that?
Please tell me once again. I'm sorry, I'm a little slow in understanding because
World
I want to
Heritage
really
nomination.
Yeah.
World Heritage nomination for cities.
Yes.
Tends to lead to the same process of heritage-led urban regeneration, which focuses on tourism and gentrification of local communities.
No. No, I think these are two different things because the goals are different.
Okay, please
because
explain.
Urban regeneration. Sorry.
A lot of young people listening. Please explain. Yeah.
Yes, you see, urban regeneration with what they say tourism.
Yeah, which focuses on tourism and gentrification.
On tourism. No, I think you see this is something which is really, in my view. You see, if tourism is your angle, then I think you are really in trouble because this is what is happening. And I must say, the World Heritage nomination is something which is extremely a kind of a kind of theoretical study, which actually leads into research, and then you sort of qualify, also talk about the values. So I think it's a kind of long drawn process, which is a multidisciplinary process. Whereas urban regeneration for tourism is something, which in my view, this is happening now. You see, heritage sites are being developed for tourism. And see what kind of havoc they are making,
I think that's the question. What you just raised is what the
yes.
person is trying to ask. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Because I know I can give examples of number of sites, which have extreme, historic importance. And since they are being developed for tourism, you see, I think it is really destroying the historicity as well as the sites themselves, And this is happening everywhere in India, including most important archaeological sites, So I think this is something, which has to be, handled very carefully, this regeneration with tourism as the focus.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's some questions over here. Thanks, Professor Vasavada. I think these are challenging issues. There's some questions here. Which country has large number of World Heritage sites, whatever? Please go to UNESCO website and do your own research. It's easier rather than ask Ritika. And also the same thing that somebody is asking me, sort of had an opportunity to visit Ahmedabad while on the 2017 Delhi Commerce Conference, found the city's sense of culture and history captivating. What are the OUAs, for which once again, it's best that given time constraints and the number of questions, because we only have another 10 minutes, please go to the UNESCO website and you have OEV, the criteria for which it is listed in detail, it's much easier than us trying to repeat it here. And then there's, okay, there's one for Ritika here. God, they keep coming.
Inspiring questions.
They're moving very fast.
Yes.
Okay, this one, maybe you can, this is for you, Anna. What are the key challenges with understanding heritage values in conflict zones?
Yes, it's challenging. I think it goes back to my question that it reflects then the society in it, and if they are less tolerant to other cultures, especially if the different cultures are in conflict, that there you really have problems understanding the values not of your own culture but of the heritage of the other culture. And you see that in many places, even in the World Heritage List, where there has been this problem of choosing one narrative or trying to erase the other narrative. But as a small teaser of the question on the which countries have the most, in 2015 we did a study on urban areas, and we found out that France, China, Italy, Mexico, and Germany were the top 5. But it can be that right now, 2020, so we should do the study again if any student is listening. By 2015, those are the countries.
There's a comment from Nigeria, from Lagos. All the way from Nigeria, Dr. Guri Shankar says, I understand the concern of Vasavada, but tourism cannot be blamed for the destruction of heritage. On the contrary, heritage motivates tourists to visit places, and the problem of heritage destruction due to lack of proper planning. We all agree. I think Professor Vasavada agrees with that too.
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
But that is not happening. That is
That's
one thing, which is also a concern.
Yeah. Please go on. You want to make any more comments?
No, I mean, no, I completely agree with him. Yeah. There are sites, which are under control and which are extremely sort of important, are well managed, but there are some sites, which are completely out of control and they're destroyed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
We've got huge challenges given that it's the world's fastest growth industry, which will bounce back post-pandemic. For almost 20 years, it's been the fastest growth industry. And this morning, I was listening to a discussion in Australia on the radio that Australia is already in advanced stages of planning for prompting domestic tourism. So much so that they're actually giving vouchers to people in Victoria, to go to the countryside. They realize international tourism will take some time. So it is going to bounce back, and there are going to be major issues. Ritika, this one is for you, apparently. They're saying that your name is specifically mentioned. The linguistic root of heritage, as also patrimoine in French, is inheritance, no more and no less. It is not qualified by cultural or any other categorization. Has the institutionalization, categorization, and the concept that heritage is foremost cultural has to be selected and listed to survive lost the total point, the whole point?
So I agree that heritage, the word heritage itself means inheritance, no more, no less. However, institutionalizing, and I would not agree when one says that heritage is foremost cultural, because the moment we say heritage is inheritance, nature is as much an inheritance as any monument or any intangible practice. So heritage is foremost inheritance. It is however, the institutionalization of between culture and nature is important because more often than not, when we think of heritage, the perception still seems to be a monument, the perception still seems to be something tangible. So in order to expand the understanding of heritage in practice, it is important to divide it into culture, nature, intangible, documentary. So the point is not being lost, definitely.
Thank you, Ritika.
Maybe a comment.
Yeah, sure.
Because there are studies at the moment focusing on education programs of primary and more other levels of schools, and it can be that this reflection on the monuments, on the temples, on the churches, on the castles, on that it's also very much rooted on what was taught to them or to us. If I remember my books, my teaching books of history and social sociology. So I think I wonder, and I put myself also a question to Rikita and Professor Vasavada, if you don't think that also the education programs should change the narratives and include this richness of heritage as well, which is not yet the case in many countries.
Over to you, Ritika and Professor Vasavada.
Okay. No, certainly, this has to be there, and I think there is initiative from many such, schools, to somehow include uh, orienting students to the values and heritage in general. So there are these kind of efforts. I think INTAC itself is undertaking this kind of awareness program which are addressed to schools, and they have also published enormous amount of literature. I think Ritika would know better, and uh, this is something which is made available to schools. But yes, it is very important to start at the level of schools, in order to somehow generate awareness in the next generation. And I think efforts have to be seriously made, to sort of make the education, the policy in such a way that it includes, heritage as one of the important aspect of the study of history. Because they already learn history, but I think history with this angle of heritage, which is built environment, it's something, which is missing from there. So I think this is something, which one can really include as part of the historic, subjects of history.
Ritika, would you like to add?
Yes, in fact, I would like to share how I have seen the notion of heritage change from when I was in school to now, which is decades ago when I was in school. We were taught history properly. There was focus on history, there was focus on the monuments. But the concept of heritage and taking care of our heritage was not imbibed in us. Now, I see school students and I see teachers and resource people taking young children to, I mean, children are young, of course, taking children to heritage sites, and they have programs such as Adopt a Monument or Adopt a Tree or Friends with a Craftsperson. So this is how they're made to interact one-on-one and take the responsibility of preserving their heritage with their own hands. So I think this is something very positive and very inviting, and we will of course only grow in terms of school curriculum from here.
I just love that optimism of your generation, Ritika. Just be like that. That's fantastic. Okay, there's
We'll
a
try.
suggestion for a future webinar on linking heritage and human rights. Yes, we've noted that. It definitely is it could, like whoever it is says it could be challenging. Then there is a question about which language is heritage language. Um, well, I'm not sure.
Every language, I would say.
That's it. Yeah. What did you say, Anna? Could you repeat?
Every language.
Every language.
Yeah, if it's an
I
inheritance.
would say it's the language of humanity.
Yes. As many languages as humanity has, I would say. Yeah.
And Anna, there's a question to you. How do you see the political relevance of tourism as the main interest to encourage implementation of conservation actions?
That's a nice question, and I will answer with a metaphor. What do you think about marriage for money?
Good one. Uh,
I think that sums up.
it does. I think you put it really well. I think that we've reached the end of the time because we also have technical people staying on late, so I have to think about them. But before I thank you all, I think that our participants uh, and the panelists, the one thing in all my life, I've been in the heritage field now, this is my 44th year. And one of the first things that I couldn't understand is this nature-culture dichotomy, which is a colonial dichotomy. Because in India, you don't have that in our traditional knowledge. Africa, you don't. And in most countries, you don't have this nature-culture binary. And so how do we deal with it? And I can tell you that having been in the Rio Plus 10 in Johannesburg, African countries came together. They actually criticized this, saying, we don't have nature culture binary here. This is a colonial introduction, this binary. And so there was a decision made that we should take a holistic approach, which Anna advocates very strongly anyway. And but then by the time it went to the UN Environment Council in New York, it was dumped. So all that, Johannesburg discourse was completely forgotten and back to nature culture, too much of headache to deal with it. But I think that there are a lot of seminars, but it's people who are converted talking to themselves. And I think it needs more fingers in the dirt, like Ritika knows we did in Vietnam, fingers in the dirt. Suddenly you realize Halong Bay is no more, it's listed for its natural values, but really there are people living there and they have cultural values writ large across the landscapes and the waterscapes of Halong Bay. So how do we deal with these issues? So some of these issues will keep coming. So before I wind up and thank the panelists, I want to tell all the participants that we've asked all the panelists in the 43 of them until the last webinar, and we'll ask the 3 panelists now again to send us a 5 to 1,000 word summary by the end of the month, by the end of December. We're going to pull it together. This is the request from our survey. We're going to pull it together into a volume, very simple volume called Heritage Matters. And so you will have something tangible in terms of ebook as well as print on demand. All the webinars are recorded. We have sound bites so that if you have bandwidth issues, you can listen to the sound. But if you don't have bandwidth issues at any given time, where you might be in a place where bandwidth is not an issue, you can listen to the video recording. That too, they're a bit longer. Some of them go for nearly 2 hours. So we're editing them down to 1 hour, 1 hour, 10 minutes slowly. And they're all on YouTube. So you can go to our webpage and that you'll get a link when you get a post webinar email, and you can go there. They're all on the YouTube. And I'm really delighted to say that so many universities are using the recordings for tutorials. And we would really like some feedback. And as we say goodbye, those of you are leaving, festive season. I'm not just saying Christmas, New Year, because it's also harvest season in a place like in India. So we are so multicultural, so mixed. For over a whole month, we have festivals of different kinds. Enjoy them, but be careful, be safe, take care. But once again, thank you to our wonderful panelists. Anna, I know it's not late for you, but
Well, it's
thank you
getting
so much,
darker,
Anna.
but but
So
it's not
wonderful.
late yet.
Yeah,
It's
so
later
wonderful.
by you.
And thank you so much for
You're welcome. It was a
taking
pleasure.
all the questions and answering with such a gorgeous smile. And Professor Vasavada, thank you so much. Very crisp answers. And that comes with, wisdom that you carry with you like a walking encyclopedia. And Ritika, thank you. I think your generation needs to keep asking the questions. Maybe your previous generations have tried, might not have been able to do the right thing, but believe me, we tried our best. And but you got to keep asking the questions. And I think that the future is, as you put it very optimistically, something to look forward to. And I would also like to thank Sharvari, who's helped organize, and Vishal, who is behind the scenes managing the technical side. So Vishal, Sharvari, thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. And most
Thank you.
importantly, thank you to the participants.